They will tell you Rome was built by discipline, by law, by roads that stitched the world together. They will tell you it brought order to chaos. But listen closely, before the banners rise and the trumpets sound, before the story hardens into marble, and you may hear another Rome breathing beneath it. This story is for those voices history taught itself not to hear, for the women who did not fall in battle, but were carried away from it, for the ones who survived and were erased. I remember the moment my name stopped meaning anything. It happened before the chains. It happened when the shouting became a single sound, when the smoke turned the sky into a ceiling, when my mother's hand slipped from mine, not because she chose to let go, but because someone struck her hard enough to make her fall. I never saw her rise. The men in iron moved through our streets with practiced calm, stepping over bodies as if over broken furniture. They were not wild. That is what frightened me most. They were orderly, efficient. Rome had arrived. By the time they gathered us, those of us still standing, still breathing, I already understood that whatever I had been before would not survive the day. My village had no walls worth naming, no temples of stone. We were counted quickly, men separated from women, children pulled from arms, old ones left where they fell. No cruelty was announced, no hatred was spoken. There was only process. A soldier looked at me and spoke a word I did not understand. He touched my chin, turned my face toward the light as if examining a coin. Then he marked something on a wax tablet and moved on. In that gesture, my life was reduced to inventory. We marched for days. The chains came later, once the shock wore off and the screaming turned hoarse. At night we lay close together, not for comfort, but because the ground was cold and there was nowhere else to go. Some women whispered prayers. Some stared without blinking. A few tried to remember names aloud as if repetition might anchor them to themselves. I stopped speaking early. Silence felt safer. Silence made me smaller. When we reached the camp, Rome revealed another of its faces. Tents in perfect lines. Fires controlled, contained. Men laughing, eating, polishing armor still darkened with blood. We were led past them, our eyes lowered not by command but by instinct. Power radiated from them casually like heat. No one needed to threaten us. The law had already done that. I learned later that under Roman rule, consent was a word reserved for citizens. Slaves were property. Property does not refuse. That night they separated us again. The youngest first. The prettiest. The ones whose fear had not yet dulled their features. A woman beside me began to sob when her turn came. She tried to cling to the ground. A soldier pried her fingers loose one by one, patiently as if correcting a child. When she returned, hours later, she did not speak. She did not cry. She lay down and curled inward, her arms wrapped around herself like restraints. No one asked what happened. We all knew. By the time we reached Rome, I had been renamed twice. Once by a soldier who could not pronounce my language and laughed when I tried to correct him. Once more by the man who bought me. He chose a name that suited him, not me. Something short. Convenient. Something that belonged to his house. The slave market smelled of oil and sweat and citrus peels crushed underfoot. Marble columns rose above us, white and smooth, catching the sun. Buyers moved between us with bored expressions, discussing price and quality in the same tones they used for livestock. Teeth checked. Hips measured. Skin pinched. A man commented that I would last. I did not know what he meant, but the way he said it hollowed my chest. When I was sold, a clerk recorded the transaction carefully. Law protected both parties. No law mentioned me. The villa where I was taken was vast, its walls painted with scenes of gods pursuing women who never seemed to escape. I was shown where to sleep. On the floor near the kitchen, I was taught when to speak rarely, where to walk always behind, how to lower my eyes. They did not beat me often. They did not need to. Order was maintained through expectation, through example, through the quiet certainty that resistance would only prolong pain. My master was a man of influence. Guests praised his taste, his education, his restraint. He spoke of virtue often. At night, his footsteps approached without hurry. He never raised his voice. He never asked. Afterward, I would lie awake and study the ceiling beams, counting the cracks until my thoughts slowed enough to feel nothing at all. In the morning, I washed and served and moved through rooms filled with laughter. No one looked at me closely. That was part of the design. Suffering hidden behind marble still supports the roof. Sometimes I saw other women like me, at the baths, in the streets, carrying water or baskets or infants that were not theirs. We did not acknowledge one another openly. Recognition itself felt dangerous. But in passing there were glances held a fraction too long, a tightening of the jaw, a shared understanding that this was not temporary. That this was the rest of our lives, measured not in years but in usefulness. Rome called this civilization. I learned the city by its sounds, the clatter of carts on stone, the distant roar of crowds at games where blood was entertainment, the soft rustle of silk as free women passed me, perfumed and untouched. I learned the hours by my body's tension, by the way dread sharpened as evening approached. I learned obedience so thoroughly that it began to feel like part of my spine. And yet, inside, something watched. It watched as masters spoke of conquest with pride, describing lands taken, peoples subdued. It watched as women were gifted between men like ornaments, like jokes. It watched as priests invoked gods who sanctioned all of this, who smiled down from frescoed ceilings, while women below learned how to disappear without dying. There were moments, rare, fleeting, when rage flickered, when I imagined screaming in the atrium, tearing down statues, forcing them to see. But rage requires the belief that someone will listen. Rome had trained that belief out of me. Years passed. I aged in ways no one marked. My body became efficient, resilient, quieter. New girls arrived, eyes wide, voices still loud with disbelief. I did not comfort them. Comfort felt like a lie. Instead, I taught them how to survive. Where to stand, when to lower their gaze, how to leave their minds when they needed to. One winter, a woman died in the servants' quarters. Fever, they said. She had been unwell for weeks, working until she collapsed. Her body was carried out before dawn, wrapped in cloth. By midday, someone else slept in her place. The household continued without pause. Rome did not notice the subtraction. I sometimes tried to remember my first name. It came to me in pieces, distorted by years of disuse. Saying it silently felt like touching a scar, painful, but proof that something had once been whole. In the end, there was no dramatic escape, no reckoning. Empires do not end for people like me. They simply move on. When I grew too slow, too tired, I was sold again. Cheaper this time. Older goods depreciate. I went to another house, another master, another set of rules identical in all the ways that mattered. The city changed. Emperors changed. Laws were rewritten and praised. Roads stretched farther. Statues rose. Names were carved into stone. Mine never was. If you walk through Rome centuries from now, you will marvel at what remains. You will speak of engineering, of governance, of legacy. You will say this is what greatness looks like. And beneath your feet, beneath every triumphal arch and polished floor, lie the stories no one thought worth preserving. Women who were taken, used, silenced, and buried without marker or memory. This is how empires endure, not only by conquest, but by forgetting. I learned that forgetting was not accidental. It was trained. In the new house, the rules were spoken aloud the first day, as if clarity made them merciful. I was told where I could stand, when I could eat, which rooms were forbidden unless summoned. I was told that my body belonged to the household, that injury to it would be punished only if it reduced my usefulness. This was explained calmly, almost kindly, like instructions for caring for a tool. The house was smaller than the first, but no less Roman. Mosaic floors depicting hunts and victories. Bronze lamps shaped like lions' heads. A courtyard where water whispered endlessly into stone. The sound followed me everywhere, even into sleep, a reminder that the house itself was alive, enduring, while those within it were replaceable. Here I worked closer to the family. I poured wine at dinners where men reclined and spoke of politics, of campaigns, of the moral decay of conquered peoples. I stood close enough to hear them praise Roman restraint, Roman order, Roman superiority. Their words washed over me like ash. I wondered if any of them understood the irony, or if irony itself was a luxury reserved for the free. The mistress of the house rarely looked at me. When she did, her gaze slid away quickly, as if contact itself threatened the fragile structure of her life. Once, when I was slow to refill a cup, she struck me across the face. Not hard enough to bruise, but hard enough to remind me of my place. Her hand shook afterward. Mine did not. I had learned where to store reaction, how to lock it away where it would not inconvenience anyone. At night, I slept lightly. Sleep had become something to ration. Too deep, and you risked being startled awake, disoriented, exposed. Too shallow, and the body began to fail. I balanced between the two, hovering in a state where dreams could not reach me. When memories surfaced, my mother's voice, the smell of rain on soil untouched by stone, I pushed them back down. Memory was dangerous. Memory reminded me of what had been taken, and grief was heavier than chains. I watched new conquests arrive in the city. Processions marched through the streets, soldiers adorned with wreaths, spoils piled high. Captives followed behind, their heads bowed, their wrists bound. Crowds cheered. Children laughed. Rome celebrated itself openly, without shame. I stood among the other slaves holding baskets and felt something inside me turn to stone. Sometimes I imagined that the city itself fed on us, that its marble drank the sweat and blood that seeped into it, that its grandeur was built not just on labor, but on silence. Every unspoken cry was another brick, every endured night another column. Rome rose because we were pressed beneath it, until there was no room left to breathe. There was a girl in the house younger than me, newly arrived from somewhere east. She still flinched at sudden movements, still whispered prayers in a language no one else understood. One evening after the household had settled, she asked me quietly if it ever ended. The question was so small, so fragile, that it almost broke me. I did not lie to her. I told her it changed. I told her she would learn how to survive it. She nodded as if this was an answer she had expected. The next morning, she no longer spoke to me. Survival, I had learned, often required distance. Years layered themselves over me like dust. I watched boys grow into men, watched masters age, watched power shift hands without ever loosening its grip. I was moved again, and again traded when convenient, retained when useful. Each transfer erased a little more of whatever trace remained of who I had been. My body learned compliance so deeply that even my thoughts began to anticipate commands before they were spoken. Yet somewhere, beneath that conditioning, a witness remained. It watched as Roman law was debated and refined, as jurists argued over property rights with exquisite precision. It watched as philosophers spoke of virtue and reason while stepping over women like me without seeing us. It watched as temples rose to gods who sanctioned conquest, who turned violation into destiny. This witness understood something Rome never wrote down, that cruelty does not always roar. Often it whispers. Often it smiles. Often it wears the face of order. When I was old enough that my value diminished to labor alone, the nights became quieter. In that quiet, something like grief finally surfaced. Not sharp, not overwhelming, but vast. A mourning not just for myself, but for all the women whose names had been taken, whose stories had dissolved into the stone beneath our feet. We were countless. We were invisible by design. I began to think of time differently. Not as a path forward, but as layers burying us deeper. Future generations would walk these streets and marvel. They would study inscriptions and laws. They would call this an age of greatness. And they would never know how many lives were crushed to make it possible, how many women learned to disappear so thoroughly that even history forgot to look for them. One evening, as I carried water across the courtyard, I paused. Just for a moment. The sky above Rome was the color of ash and gold. Swallows darted between rooftops. The city breathed eternal and indifferent. I felt very small, and very certain. Empires remember themselves carefully. They choose what to preserve: roads, aqueducts, statues, laws. They do not carve the sound of a woman learning to be silent into stone. They do not record the moment a name is taken away. They do not build monuments to endurance without recognition. But we were here. We felt the weight of Rome pressing down on our backs, on our throats, on our lives. We carried its grandeur quietly, invisibly, until there was nothing left of us but the labor we had given and the silence we had learned to keep. If there is a ghost beneath this city, it is not a general or an emperor. It is a chorus of women whose stories were never told, whose suffering was legal, normalized, and buried beneath centuries of praise. Rome will be remembered for its roads and its laws. We will be remembered only if someone listens hard enough to hear what the stone refuses to say. In the later years, when my body no longer startled at every footstep, I began to notice the smallest things. The way dust settled differently on statues that were never touched. The way laughter echoed longer in rooms where no one worked. The way the city smelled just before rain, when the stone released the heat it had stored all day. These details became my refuge, fragments of a world that did not belong to anyone, not even Rome. Age did not grant respect, it granted invisibility. I was moved to tasks that required less strength but more patience, sorting linens, grinding grain, tending fires that must never go out. Fires were dangerous things in Rome. A spark could destroy a neighborhood. I was trusted with this risk not because I was valued, but because my loss would be manageable. That was the measure of trust given to slaves, how easily we could be replaced. Sometimes I caught my reflection in polished bronze. The woman who stared back felt unfamiliar. Lines traced her face like faint scars. Her eyes held something flat, something guarded. I searched her features for the girl who once knew the names of trees, the rhythm of seasons not dictated by bells or commands. She did not answer. Perhaps she was gone. Perhaps she was hiding somewhere so deep that even I could not reach her. Rome around me continued its rituals. Festivals filled the streets with color and sound. Triumphs paraded new captives through cheering crowds. Each time I watched carefully, not for the generals, but for the women at the end of the line. I recognized the look in their eyes before they did. The disbelief. The terror held at bay by shock. I wanted to warn them. I wanted to tell them that survival would demand a forgetting so thorough it would ache. But words would not help. Nothing had helped me. There was a moment, small, unremarkable by Roman standards, that stayed with me. A senator's guest noticed me as I poured wine. He smiled, commented on my obedience, on my silence. Rome civilizes even the wildest, he said, lifting his cup. The others nodded. Approval circled the table. I stood there steady and felt something inside me grow very still. This, I understood, was the heart of it. Not violence alone, but the belief that violence had been transformed into virtue. That breaking us was framed as improvement. That night, I lay awake listening to the city. Somewhere, a woman cried out briefly, then stopped. Somewhere else, a child laughed. Somewhere, a man recited poetry about honor. All of it existed together, woven into the same vast indifference. Rome did not see contradiction. Rome absorbed everything. As my usefulness waned further, I was lent out to another household. Temporary, they said. Nothing about slavery was permanent except its logic. In this house, the floors were simpler, the wealth less ostentatious, but the rules were the same. Power did not require luxury to assert itself. It lived comfortably in bare rooms as well as gilded ones. The younger slaves looked at me differently. Some with pity, some with calculation. I had become a lesson. This is what survives. This is what remains. I taught them what I could, how to avoid attention, how to read moods, how to disappear at the right moments. It was a poor inheritance, but it was all I had. I stopped counting years. Time in Rome was measured by reigns, by wars, by construction. My life did not intersect with those markers. It ran alongside them unacknowledged. When emperors fell, nothing changed for us. When laws were revised, nothing changed for us. The system endured because it did not depend on individual cruelty. It depended on acceptance. Sometimes when I carried water at dawn, I imagined the city empty. No footsteps. No commands. Just stone and sky. I imagined the walls listening at last, absorbing the truth they had helped conceal. It was a foolish thought. Stone remembers only what it is told to remember. When I felt death approaching, not dramatically, but as a slow loosening, I was not afraid. Fear had been used up long ago. What I felt was a quiet urgency, a desire that something of this be known, even if only in the abstract, even if only as a whisper carried forward by those who would never know my face. I understood then that history is not only written by the victors, it is preserved by them, and what they choose not to preserve vanishes unless someone insists on listening for it. My body would be disposed of efficiently. No rites, no name spoken. Another absence added to the city's foundations. Rome would continue. It always did. But somewhere, beneath the roads and laws, beneath the statues and speeches, beneath the stories Rome told about itself, there would remain the weight of us. Of women taken as war spoils. Of lives reduced to function. Of suffering made legal and therefore invisible. If you stand in this city long enough, if you press your ear to the stone and listen beyond what you are taught to hear, you may sense it. A heaviness. A silence that is not empty. That is where we are. Not rescued. Not remembered properly, but present. Buried beneath the empire that called itself eternal, waiting not for justice but for acknowledgement. Waiting for someone someday to understand that every road Rome built was paved with lives it chose to forget.